Hello friends, Jeff here from House of Heresy, and back again with a uh, video we haven't done in a while actually. So we're going to be doing another one of our Commander EDH, in this case CEDH deck tech videos. I'm hoping to bring this back into the regular rotation, but life has still been kind of crazy, so we'll see how it goes. Not going to make any promises that I'll be able to do this every Saturday, but hopefully we're moving back in that direction. We'll see how it goes going into the summer months. So, background behind this deck. We locally, I play in a Commander League, not as regularly as I'd like, but they meet every week with about their season's running about 5 weeks long, 4 or 5 weeks, and then they take a break from a week or two and then go into the next season. I try to catch it when I can. But one thing that they have done once before was they ran kind of a quasi CEDH type tournament or event. It was fun. We had about the same crowd as that's in the league, plus some additional people from the local area who jumped in, some actual CEDH players. The league itself kind of has a varying power level, anywhere from like pre-con level all the way up to, if not CEDH, then pretty darn close, depending on the pod, and everything in between. So that event was kind of an oddball one because we had people bringing their more powerful decks, but there wasn't a consistent true CEDH population that was participating in that. So after that, I decided I wanted to, because I figured we were going to do more of them at some point. So I decided to start kind of working in that direction. Had an idea for a deck that I wanted to do, and was just kind of brewing it slowly, very slowly, for months and months, just slowly picking up cards here and there until the guy that ran the last one announced that we were going to do another one in May. And that took place this past weekend. So this is my deck that I brought to it. It is probably not truly at the CEDH level. It's as close as I made it, or as I could make it. However, doing some research, because this deck does see a little bit of play and sometimes does well. There's some variations that I'll talk about that those decks that I've seen online tend to have a little bit more of than I do in this one. And I'll talk about the tournament in more specifics afterwards. But needless to say, I did not do that great. Did not win a single game. And the way that the tournament was set up, I forget the software that they were using, but if you win, you got points. If you win, you got 5 points. If the whole pod drew, everyone got 1 point, and then everybody else but the winner, or those that drew, got 0 points. So you essentially needed to win/draw at least 2 games to make it into the top 16. So after 4 rounds, the people that were in the top 16 got to play the 5th round, and then the winners of those pods got to play in the final 4. And that's how it worked out. So the organizer did a great job, some really cool prizes. He prioritized CEDH staples, so you had everything from like Ragavan to, I think there was a Grim Monolith, Mox Opal, Mana Crypts, those types of things. It wasn't like there was just a bunch of junk cards. It was all cards that see some form of play in EDH and CEDH, generally speaking. So let's talk about the deck, and then at the end I'll talk about the tournament. So this deck is built around Saffi Eriksdotter. This was most recently printed in Time Spiral Remastered. That's where I was introduced to it. I'm pretty sure it was in one of the Time Spiral block sets. I couldn't tell you which one. I wasn't really playing back then. But she is Selesnya, so the deck is Selesnya, green and white for a 2/2. And she has sacrifice Saffi Eriksdotter. When target creature is put into your graveyard this turn, return that card to the battlefield. So she is a combo piece. And you probably would see her more likely in the 99 than as a commander. But basically, the way the combo works is she needs to be on the battlefield at some point in the combo. And then you also need a second creature. And we have a couple different options. And they all have pros and cons that I'll talk about as we go through this. So Renegade Rallier is one. Basically, the second creature needs to be able to bring a creature that's already in the battlefield back to the battlefield. So you need Saffi. She will sacrifice herself targeting one of these reanimators, and then she enters the graveyard. Then the reanimator will sacrifice itself in a sack outlet of some kind. It will enter the graveyard, and then it's Saffi's trigger that was applied to the reanimator will trigger, bringing it back from the graveyard, and then the reanimator will bring Saffi back, thus creating an infinite loop depending of some outcome, depending on which sack outlet you're utilizing. And then there's 4 reanimators in the deck. They all perform the same function, but they do it a little bit differently. So Renegade Rallier is Selesnya and a generic for a 3/2 with Revolt. So when Renegade Rallier enters the battlefield, if a permanent you controlled left the battlefield this turn, return target permanent card with CMC 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. So the cool thing about Renegade Rallier is that it technically doesn't care what it's reanimating. It's not based on creature or anything like that. It just has to be 2 CMC or less. So this can create some situations where you could potentially sack, say one of the sack outlets generates you mana. You could technically sack Saffi to that to generate mana to help pay for Renegade Rallier. Renegade Rallier enters the battlefield, sees that something has left the battlefield this turn, a permanent has left the battlefield this turn, and then can bring Saffi back. Or if you, say, cracked a fetch land or a Lotus Petal or something like that, it would see that as well and could bring one of those in. Urza Saga, something along those lines. So there's some decent utility, and it's our only green one, which we'll get into a little bit later on. But that can be important in determining how you choose to search for and create your combo. And the other thing too is that it's also a human along with Saffi, and that has some importance later on as well for some of our tech pieces essentially. So Renegade Rallier is one, Extraction Specialist is another one. White 2 generic for a 3/2, also a human. Got lifelink, really shouldn't matter unless things are really going south for you. When Extraction Specialist ETBs, return target creature card with mana value 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. That creature can't attack or block for as long as you control Extraction Specialist, which you don't care about. Saffi, her ability doesn't require her to tap, doesn't care that if she has Summoning Sickness or not. You're not going to be attacking with her, so Extraction Specialist is another way to create the loop. Karmic Guide. The next two are the more expensive ones. They both cost 5, whereas the other 2 cost 3. And then the other thing of note for these creatures so far is that they all have 2 toughness. So we'll keep an eye on that as well for some of the ways that we work towards this loop. So Karmic Guide, 5 mana for a 2/2, Angel Spirit, so not a human. Flying Protection from black. It's got Echo, so you would sacrifice it at the beginning of your upkeep if it came under your control since the beginning of your last upkeep. Ideally, if you're playing Karmic Guide, you should that shouldn't matter so much. You should be hopefully having one before then. And then when Karmic Guide enters the battlefield, return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. And then finally, Revelark. So Revelark, also not a human. This one does not have 2 toughness. It's 5 mana for a 4/3, a little bit easier to cast just because it's 4 generic and 1 white instead of Karmic Guide having 2 of the white pips on there. It's also a flyer. So Revelark's a little bit different in that it triggers when it leaves the battlefield. So when Revelark leaves the battlefield, return up to 2 target creatures with power 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. And that's the other thing too, is it can actually reanimate 2 creatures. A little bit situational. The leaves the battlefield instead of enters the battlefield gets you around some of the stacks pieces out there. I don't recall actually seeing the new Alish Norn, but this would allow you to not have to interact negatively with the newest Alish Norn, or I guess the second newest Alish Norn that cares about the one from Phyrexial will be one. So there is some utility in having a leave the battlefield trigger versus an enters the battlefield trigger. It just changes the the way the interaction happens on the stack, essentially, as these cards enter and leave the battlefield. Okay, so those are the those are the reanimators, and then we get into, actually probably shouldn't, I'll put that one on the bottom there. So then we get into the sack outlets. So there's 2 sack outlets that will, with that loop, will just win us the game, or one that will win us the game, the other one that should win us the game. The first one's Blasting Station. 3 generic for an artifact. You tap it, sacrifice a creature. Blasting Station deals 1 damage to target creature or player. And then whenever a creature comes into play, you may untap Blasting Station. So this one would, I believe, would get shut down with the Elish Norn Mother of Machines. But regardless, this is the cleanest win condition because it straight up does the damage and will kill each player on your turn. The other option, the other win condition, is Altar of Dementia. 2 generic for sack a creature. Target player mills cards equal to the sacrificed creature's power, which would either be 2 or 3, depending on which of the sack outlets we're using. Or actually 4. 2, 3, or 4. Yeah, because Revel Arc is 4. But that wouldn't, unless you, which we don't really have. We don't have a way to force players to draw cards other than ourselves. So the downside to this is you would allow each of your opponents an untap and upkeep before they would draw their cards. So there is some potential that they could come out with a win before they go to their card draw and then lose the game because they're milled out. And then we have some more just generic sack outlets that help us in other ways, either generating infinite mana, such as Astronaut's Altar, gives us 2 generic for each sack, and Phyrexian Altar gives us 1 mana of any color for each sack. These won't win in and of themselves, but they will either facilitate us finding our win conditions, or if we have Altar of the Brood out, is essentially becomes a 4 card combo piece. So Altar of the Brood is 1 generic for an artifact. Whenever another permanent enters the battlefield under your control, each opponent puts the top card of his or her library into his or her graveyard. So it's kind of like Altar of Dementia, but you're not. Altar of the Brood itself is not a sack outlet. So just having this in Saffi and one of the reanimators won't do anything because you don't have any way to sack the reanimator to initiate the loop. But if you have one of the other sack outlets, then you can use that to mill your opponents out. So that's the loop. That's how we win. Obviously, this is what, like 6, 7 cards? 1, 2, 3, 4, 9 cards. So this is 9 cards in a 99 card deck. Not going to be not super likely that we would find that in our opening hand. So what are some other ways that we can get to that point with this deck? And this is where the real downside to the deck occurs. You are going to be most successful with the Saffi deck if you start with a strong opening hand. And that's true with most CEDH. I think you could safely say that your opening hand is probably the most important decision that you make in the game. Because if you don't mulligan aggressively to get what you need, then you're probably going to be too slow. And hoping for a top deck is never the position that you want to be in such a fast format like this. But especially in this deck, because we just don't have as much of the redundancy as other decks do, because we have tutors, but we don't have great tutors. We don't have black to go tutor for anything. We have some interaction, but we don't have great interaction because we don't have blue, so we don't have the ability to really counteract what your opponents are doing to protect ourselves or be more aggressive in stopping theirs. So you're kind of relying on other people being bigger threats to draw out interaction, and you just kind of getting to where you need to go. Part of my preparation for this deck, I goldfished a ton. Just a ton. Hours and hours and hours of just either on Moxfield or once they had the deck built, just going through the whole thing. And I could win as early as turn 2. I never pulled off a turn 1 win, but generally speaking, it was turn 3 to 5 was where this deck was most likely to come out on top. And that's in a goldfish environment where I have no interaction coming at me. I'm just playing the cards that I'm drawing by myself there, essentially. So So it's a slower deck that needs a really strong opening hand to have a chance. And in the tournament, I was not aggressive enough with my mulligans. I can say that for a fact. And I'd never had the opening hand that gave me the opportunity to compete because the closest I was ever getting to threatening would have been like turn 4, and even then that was kind of questionable. So okay, so then how can we get to that point? So there's a couple different ways that we can do it. We do have some steps to enable the win con. First of which being Academy Rector. This is a older, more expensive card off the reserve list. So for 3 and a white for a 1/2, also 2 toughness, 2 toughness, and a human. So again, things to keep in mind. When Academy Rector is put into the graveyard from play, you may exile Academy Rector from the game, so from your graveyard. If you do, search your library for an enchantment card and put that card into play, then shuffle your library. So this allows us to go find an enchantment. Now you'll notice that nothing in the combo enabled us to, or nothing in the combo is an enchantment. So this essentially creates an extra step, but it does allow us to get there. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. I just actually, where is it at? Okay, so basically, there's two ways that we could go using Academy Rector. The most reliable way is Greater Good in 75% of your combo loops. So you for Greater Good, it's cost really doesn't matter. I almost never would cast this. I use Academy Rector to pull it out because it's a lot easier for me to either. Well, I guess that's not true. Sometimes you would cast it. So it's 4 mana, 2 green, 2 generic. You sack a creature, draw cards equal to the sacrifice creature's power, then discard 3 cards. So this is a sack outlet that lets us draw cards, lets us filter through our deck to get to what we need. Downsides to this card is that it is a sack outlet. It does let us draw cards, but we need cards in our hand, and we need the creature's power to at least break even with the discard 3 cards. So right away, we're down to 3 of our 4 sack outlets because Karmic Guide is only power 2. So we would already be losing cards every time. So we would be rapidly running out of the ability to have a net positive or stay neutral. So, and we need to have at least a couple cards in hand so that when we're filtering through, we're not just drawing 3, discarding 3, which is what would happen if we only had 3 cards in hand with, if we didn't have any cards in hand with Greater Good. So Extraction Specialist, Renegade Rallier, these will be the 50% of our reanimators, give us a neutral amount of cards. And then if we have Revelark out there, we'll actually be generating a net positive. So it's a little bit slower, but with Academy Rector out, or utilizing Academy Rector, we can pull Greater Good directly onto the battlefield. Now, Academy Rector herself requires a sack outlet, so that's something to keep in mind as well. But that's usually, if I'm not able to go straight into the combo, this is how I'm doing it. Another alternative is to pull out, is it Fecundity or Fecundity? Yeah. This is a 2 generic and a green, another enchantment. This is whenever any creature is put into a graveyard from play, that creature's controller may draw a card. So this will work in a similar fashion to what Altar of the Brood does for us, except that this isn't giving us a win con, this is letting us draw our deck. And it's a May ability. So this one's actually pretty nice because we have a lot more control, so we don't have to worry about decking ourselves in addition to doing the combo, because ideally we want to go infinite with our combo, either through Blasting Station by doing damage or Altar of Dementia by milling them out. So we don't want to put ourselves in a position where we mill ourselves out and lose to that through self-mill before we have an opportunity to take out our opponents. So, but the downside is it affects everybody's creatures. So this is when we want to be a little bit more judicious in how you choose to play it. But we also have a decent number of enchantments here. So Academy Rector is a nice utility piece that lets us kind of pick from a menu of enchantment options that all do fairly different things, but having at least two of them that give us the ability to move into our win con is why she's pretty strong in here. Then we get Recruiter of the Guard. So this is similar to the Imperial Recruiter. This is the white version. For white 2 generic, you get a 1/1 human soldier, also human. When Recruiter of the Guard enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a creature card with toughness 2 or less, reveal it, put it into your hand, and then shuffle your library. So this is where the toughness matters. So that lets us find Academy Rector. That lets us find 3 of our 4 sack outlets. And then some of our other creatures as well. So this is a pretty strong card, and this, again, it helps us move to the direction we need to go, but it just means that we're that much slower, that we're that much further behind. But it is part of the redundancy in the color pie that we have chosen for this deck that helps us kind of move in that direction. Then you got Oswald Fiddlebender. So this one also helps us, but helps us with the other part of our combo that is located within the 99. So for a white and 1 generic, you get a 2/2 gnome artificer, so not a human, unfortunately. But you can pay a white to tap and sacrifice an artifact. You search your library for an artifact card with mana value equal to 1 plus the sacrificed artifact's mana value, put it onto the battlefield, then shuffle, activate only as a sorcery. You'll see as we go through this, we have a lot of artifacts in here. We're relying pretty heavily on artifacts to be our ramp, our fast mana. And we can generally get pretty close. If we're only stuck with 0 cost artifacts, the best we could do is pull Altar of the Brood out and hopefully have another sack outlet in place. But ideally this would get us with a one or 2 cost artifact in play, though this would get us either Altar of Dementia or the Blasting Station, one of those two. But it really is a pretty strong card, being able to go find an artifact, essentially Birthing Pod for white for artifacts here. Then we get into 2 sack outlets that are not infinite, but allow us to actually sack and are both tutorable from additional sources. So the first one is a land. It's high market. So you tap it to add a generic, or you can tap it to sacrifice a creature and you gain 1 life. Obviously, we can only do this once unless we have some way to untap the land, which we really don't have in this deck. So this is primarily a way to facilitate Academy Rector and then getting the chain going by sacking Academy Rector, getting Greater Good most likely, and then going from there. Because really, if you already have a sack outlet to take advantage of Fecundity, then you wouldn't need this. You wouldn't need to go find this. But this is a land, and we have some ways to tutor for lands, which we'll get into. The other one is Claws of Gix, and this one I actually played a few times and had some blank stares when I announced what the card was from other people, because probably very few people have actually seen this card. So it's a 0 cost artifact that you can pay 1 generic to sacrifice a permanent, and you gain 1 life. Again, if you have any of the other sack outlets, you really don't need this. But this is a card that costs 0 or 1, or an artifact card that costs 0 or 1. And as we'll see, this enables us to tutor for this in another way. So this is one of our other sack outlets that doesn't let us go infinite, but lets us take out or get Academy Rector into the graveyard, which is what we want, so that we can pull something more important. So one of the ways that we can go find high market is crop rotation. Crop rotation also lets us pull some of our other higher octane land cards out of the deck, which we'll get into in a little bit. So for 1 green, as an additional cost to cast this spell, you sacrifice a land, so hopefully it doesn't get countered when you cast it, because you have to sack the land before it resolves. And then you search your library for a land card, put that card onto the battlefield, and then shuffle. So this lets you go find a land that's untapped, and then put it onto the battlefield. And it can be any land, which is really, really nice. So as you'll see, we have some pretty strong contenders depending on what's going on, but this is one of the ways that we can get high market out if we are ready to start pulling the trigger on our combo, but we need to go through the Greater Good route or utilize enchantments and get through Academy Rector. So it's a pretty strong card. This one does not see play on most of the Saffi deck lists I've seen in the CEDH sphere. But then again, neither does Claws of Gix and High Market. So, and we'll talk more about like how mine is a little bit different than the more traditional ones at the end. Urza Saga. So this is the other way to tutor for Claws of Gix, besides the more traditional tutor that can find artifacts. So the big thing with this one, I'm sure most people are familiar with Urza Saga, but the third stage there, so this would be a minimum turn 3 when this is occurring. Search your library for an artifact card with mana cost 0 or 1, put it on the battlefield, then shuffle. So this lets us go find Claws of Gix, which then gives us a sack outlet by turn 3 if we haven't drawn one or found another way to get one, and lets us go from there. But the benefit of this card is that it also lets us go find any other artifact that costs 0 or 1, which we do have some very strong contenders as well if we don't need to go the Claws of Gix route. Expedition Map, this is another way to go tutor for a land. This is also kind of slow because you're essentially spending 3 mana. You could do this as early as turn 1, depending on what your opening hand looked like. Probably going to be more likely to see this go maybe being played on turn 1 and not actually being activated till a later turn. But this is another way to go find High Market or any other land. So you pay 1 to put it into play, and then you pay 2 generic and tap it to sacrifice it, search your library for a land card, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle your library. And then finally, Moon Silver Key. So this one's actually a very, very strong, reliable tutor for us. You wouldn't think so. It's got kind of the opposite cost of Expedition Map. So it costs a little more to play, but less to activate. So you pay 2 generic, and then it's an artifact. You pay 1 to sacrifice Moon Silver Key, search your library for an artifact card with a mana ability, or basic land card, reveal it, put it in your hand, then shuffle. This card, it's not going to give you your combo pieces for to end the game, but it will give you access to Ashnod's Altar or Phyrexian Altar, both of which super helpful when it comes to essentially to generating infinite mana or putting yourself closer into that direction. If you think you can work through it by doing some creative sacking to generate enough extra mana, or you just need ways to use like or get Altar of the Brood going, or Fecundity. So those are some other ways that we can work towards that are kind of key pieces towards getting us into our combo. Probably should have put the tutors in there too, but I kind of broke it up a little bit. These are all spells. I don't think we have any artifacts in here. So these are some more ways that we can, some more redundancy to how we get our pieces drawn into our hand or onto the battlefield, So first one's Enlightened Tutor. I'm sure this one doesn't need a lot of introduction, but for 1 white, you can search your library for an artifact or enchantment card, reveal it, then shuffle, put that card on top. So this one's really, really strong because this lets us get either of those 2 options, depending on what type of situations on the board there. Having that is nice. Downside is it goes onto your deck or onto your library instead of into your hand, but you could cast this on your upkeep so that you're guaranteed to draw it with less interaction or less potential for interaction, or on somebody's end step or whatever. So it's not the end of the world. It would be nice if it went into our hand, but that's just not how the card works. Then we got Idyllic Tutor. This one does bring it into our hand, but it costs more. It's at sorcery speed, and it's only an enchantment. So this is not optimal. You generally won't see this in most CEDH decks, but it is another level of redundancy that if we really need to go find Greater Good or any of our other enchantments, this is a way to get it into our hand. Then we got Worldly Tutor. I think the rest of these are going to be for creatures. So we have a lot, with green we have a lot easier access to finding the creatures that we need, which is why having something like the Academy Rector is so important, because we have a lot of ways to find her and get her onto the battlefield. And then we need those ways to get her into our graveyard, which is why having kind of the more fringe sack outlets in the deck and multiple ways to get them it was an important part of how I built this deck. So Worldly Tutor lets you, same thing as Enlightened, except you're searching for a creature and putting it onto your library, and it is also at instant speed. Then we got Survival of the Fittest. This one's a little bit more of a tech card. This is also an enchantment, so you could potentially go find this through one of your enchantment tutors or through the Academy Rector if you already have other pieces in place and you're just trying to get one of those creatures. So for a generic and a green, you can pay a green to choose and discard a creature card, search your library for a creature card, reveal it, put it into your hand, and shuffle your library afterwards. So this is a into your hand tutor. You do need to have a creature in your hand to do this, obviously. And then you have to be able to pay for the creature that you went and tutored for to get it into play. So it's a little bit slower, but it is a reliable way to get the creature that you need. Then we have Eldamiri's Call. This is Selesnya for search your library for a creature card, reveal that card, put it into your hand, then shuffle your library. So this one's really strong. For 2 mana, we can go find a creature, put it right into our hand. It's at instant speed, so we can do this at any point in the turn order, allowing us to leave our mana up for the interaction that we do have in the deck, and then be able to utilize this on like your player, the next player's or the previous player's end step or something to that effect. So pretty good card. I think it's definitely worth including in here. Altar of Bone, this is one that you don't see a ton of play. It's also Selesnya. It's at sorcery speed out of Ice Age, where it all started for me in Magic the Gathering. But you sack a creature to look through your library for a creature card, put it into your hand after showing it, and then shuffle your library. So this one's definitely slower. You have to have a creature in play that you sacrifice as part of the cost to cast this spell. And then you put it into your hand. So not quite as useful, but it is another way. It's only 2 mana, so it's still, for the colors that we're working with, it's not a bad option to have in here. Then we get into the all the cards that let us tutor for a creature, but they go onto the battlefield. So probably one most people are familiar with, because this is a win condition for a lot of decks. They play green and creatures. Finale of Devastation. So for 2 generic and X, you go search your library for a creature card with mana cost X or less, put it on the battlefield, and if we were to pay more than 10 mana or more, then our creatures would get +10/+10 and gain haste till end of turn. We are, I would say 99.9% of the time, never doing that. So that part's not useful, but paying essentially 5 mana to get a creature, one of our creatures, onto the battlefield is helpful. It is at sorcery speed, so that's a little bit slow, but anything that puts it direct into the battlefield cuts out on steps, which makes it better for us. Then we got Eldritch Evolutions. This one is going to be cheaper. It's only two green and 1 generic. You do have to sacrifice a creature as part of it, the cost to cast it, and then you search your library for a creature card with converted mana cost X or less, where X is 2 plus the sacrifice creature's converted mana cost. Put it on the battlefield, and then shuffle your library. So we don't have any 0-cost creatures, so if you sacrifice any creature in the deck, you will be able to get one of the Reanimators, or in most cases, Academy Rector. We do have some 1-cost creatures that you wouldn't be able to go find, but any creature that costs 2 or more. So depending on the situation, this is a pretty strong card. It does require a creature already in play, but if you're gonna, the cool thing about this one is that if you go find, say, Renegade Rallier, you sacrificing a permanent turns Renegade Rallier on when you go find him. So you could, say, play Saffi or have Saffi out on the battlefield, sacrifice her as part of the casting cost of this. She has entered the graveyard, which means a permanent has left the battlefield. So the Renegade Rallier, when it enters the battlefield, sees that and pulls Saffi back out. So it's a nice way to essentially. You're not really starting the infinite loop, but it preserves the loop when you go to play this. It is a sorcery speed as well, but the fact that you can use Saffi or have Saffi already out on the battlefield to enable this and not be punished for it makes it a pretty strong card. Then we have Green Sun Zenith. So for a green and X, you search your library for a green creature with CMC X or less, put it on the battlefield, then shuffle your library and shuffle Green Sun Zenith into the library. The only legal target we have for this for the Reanimators is Renegade Rallier. So that's really the only that's going to be the only one you're going to pull 99% of the time, I would say. We do have some other green creatures, but unless you're looking for something at a very specific point, you're most of the time you're going to be prioritizing Renegade Rallier with Green Sun Zenith. And then finally, Chord of Calling. So for 3 green and X, you have an instant, this is our only instant one that'll put it onto the battlefield, so this could be helpful. It does have Convoke. We don't have a lot of creatures in this deck, or as many, but Saffi being on the battlefield could help out, and it doesn't care if they have Summoning Sickness or not, because they're being tapped through the card and not as like an ability of their own. So Summoning Sickness is irrelevant for the purposes of convoking them. And Saffi also doesn't care if she's tapped or not when she activates her ability. So you search your library for a creature card with converted mana cost X or less, put it on the battlefield, and then shuffle your library. So most likely this is going to cost 6 or 8, because the other 2 cost 5. You could go find Academy Rector for this. And that's another thing to note with Eldritch Evolution, is that you could also use Academy Rector. So you could sack Academy Rector to essentially pull 2 combo pieces with this card. Because you sack Academy Rector, she enters the battlefield, you then can exile her to go pull an enchantment out of the graveyard out of your library onto the battlefield. Then Eldritch Evolution is going to pull a creature, mana cost 6 or less, onto the battlefield. So if you were to do that with Renegade Rallier, it would have seen also that Academy Rector was a permanent that left the battlefield. So if you had another permanent in there, because Renegade Rallier doesn't care when, like the permanent that it's pulling out, it doesn't have to have been the permanent that left the battlefield. It's just, we'll pull out a permanent that costs 2 mana value or less. So if you have something in there like a Lotus Petal that you already used, or Urza Saga or something like that, you could pull that out with there. So Eldritch Evolution is actually my favorite of the Reanimators, even though it's a sorcery and requires you to sacrifice. The fact that it's a sack outlet really can kind of allow you to essentially have just Saffi and Academy Rector on the battlefield, and you can start the combo with this one card essentially, as long as Academy Rector's on there. Okay, so that takes care of those. I think we covered all of them. Yep. Okay. So then we're going to get into what interaction do we have. We're in white and we're in green, so it's a little limited. Not gonna lie. It can be a little bit of a challenge. However, one of the really strong ways that people are interacting, that's not true interaction but kind of is stacks, and at least in CEDH. And white is king of the stacks colors right now. And they've been giving us a lot of good tools over the last 3 years or so, and it's shown. So that's definitely going to be one of the components to this pile of cards here. But let's talk about more traditional interactions. So initially, I got a single target removal. I don't have any board wipes in this deck. I thought actually about putting Armageddon in, because we have a lot of ways to generate mana without lands. And the couple times I've played with this, I actually had it played against me and enabled me to win, like before the tournament when I was doing some practice games. Somebody else casting Armageddon actually gave me the game essentially. But I ended up not going with it because I just didn't want to cut one of the other cards to put that in. So we only have single target interaction, no or stacks, which is not really single target, but also isn't proactive generally. So we got Swords to Plowshares and Path to Exile. I know Path to Exile isn't as popular because it gives your opponent or your target some land advantage there, but I have them both in there because hopefully by the time I'm using them, it's not going to matter. Then we got Nature's Claim, which is also another 1 mana single target removal for artifacts or enchantments, and we get 4 life. Force of Vigor is the green force, so it costs 4 mana, or you can, if it's not your turn, you can exile a green card from your hand, rather than pay its mana cost and destroy up to 2 target artifacts and or enchantments. March of Otherworldly Light is 1 white and X, and you can also exile white cards to add 2 generic to its casting cost there, or to the payment of it. And then you exile target artifact, creature, or enchantment with mana value X or less. So it's a pretty useful, can be useful card, especially if you have enough white cards in hand. And then we got Kenrith's Transformation. So I was trying to make sure I had a little bit of, or like multiple ways to interact with creatures on the board, in case stacks was happening and like instants and sorceries were shut down or something to that effect. And the other nice thing about Kenrith's Transformation is I can actually find this with a bunch of different ways. This is a tutorable card in the interaction category, whereas where I really don't have a way to pull instants and sorceries out of my deck. So Kenrith's Transformation is green and 1 generic to enchant creature, and when it enters the battlefield, you draw a card, which is great. 2 mana, draw a card right there in these colors is pretty solid. And then enchanted creature loses all abilities and is a green elk with base power and toughness 3/3. So while I would rather not use Academy Rector for something like this, it is an option, and it's not a terrible option. Same thing with Idyllic Tutor or Enlightened Tutor. Doesn't feel great, but if that's what it takes to shut down your opponent, and I actually did use Academy Rector to pull Kenrith's Transformation in my last game, which was the game I had the closest chance of winning, but just was not able to overcome the opponent that I cast this on. And even though it slowed him down for a couple turns, it still was not quite enough. But it gave me, I would have died otherwise. So it gave me an extra, I think, turn, maybe 2 turns, to try to find an answer or close out the game. Then you got Endurance, which is one of the elementals from Modern Horizons 2. So you could pay 2 green and 1 generic, or you could evoke it by exiling a creature card from your hand. And evoke is, you exile that green card, or did I say creature? I meant green card. Exile a green card from your hand, and then if you use the evoke cost, you sacrifice it when it enters the battlefield. So you're essentially paying for the ETB effect. It does have flash and it does have reach. And then when it enters the battlefield, you can, up to 1 target player puts all the cards from their graveyard on the bottom of their library in a random order. It's kind of a niche card. I almost didn't include it, but it is really strong, and it has the potential to blow out some people by putting a bunch of cards back into their deck. It's not a great counter for Thassa's Oracle, because most of the combo pieces with Thassa, like Demonic Consultation, is going to just exile all the cards, but it has the potential to kind of host people, or it can maybe help you out too, like if you're getting close to milling yourself out. For some of the cards that we've looked at there, it can give you a little bit of extra life. And then we get into stacks. Stacks has become a big part of CEDH from what I've seen. It's White's biggest answer to all the other interaction out there, and I'll talk about it more at the end. But this is where my deck is lacking, generally speaking, compared to how most of the Saffi decks I've seen have been created. It's one of the areas, I should say. So I do have a decent number of stacks pieces, but not enough to like where it's super consistent. So Drannith Magistrate, first one, costs white and 1 generic for 1/3 human, also human there. Your opponents can't cast spells from anywhere other than their hands. This shuts down a lot of decks, removes a lot of win cons, especially if they haven't cast their commander yet. But anybody that's casting cards out of exile or out of their graveyard, or out of their library, I guess, if they have a card that lets them cast it out of their library. So like it's not going to stop the Thoracle, generally speaking, combo, but it will shut down anybody that's using what's it called? Anybody that's using, I'm totally drawing a blank. The red enchantment that lets you cast cards from your graveyard. Underworld Breach. So it will shut down Underworld Breach, which is a popular win con. So then you got Archon of Emeria. So for a white and 2 generic, for 2/3 flying Archon, each player can't cast more than one spell each turn. In non-basic lands your opponents control enter the battlefield tapped. So this is a double whammy for your opponents, because most people in CEDH are using a lot of non-basic lands to get what they need, either through utility or to have more than one color. And yeah, it definitely slows the game down if you can only cast one spell a turn. Most decks want to go off in a turn. Definitely will slow us down unless we're down to our last combo piece, but we have a better chance of surviving if everybody is going slower than trying to outrace the more common CEDH decks. This deck is going to lose most of the time if we're in a race with a deck that wants to win on turn 1 or 2. Deafening Silence does a similar thing. Each player can't cast more than one non-creature spell each turn. So this one's specific to non-creatures, and it's an enchantment that costs 1 white. So this is another potential tutor option if you're looking for ways to slow everybody down, or it's looking like it's going to go south for you. Aven Mind Sensor. For 2 generic and a white, you get a Bird Wizard that's 2/1 with flash and flying. If an opponent would search their library or search a library, that player searches the top 4 cards of that library instead. It's not quite opposition agent, but it definitely hoses people that are looking to search for stuff, especially if you can get it out early. Like if they're tutoring or if they're fetching or whatever, it can really just hose people. Silence, this is one of our strongest cards in the deck to protect ourselves. Since we don't have a lot of counter magic in here, Silence is going to do the next best thing. So if you're going into a turn where you plan to win, a lot of times if you have the mana for it, casting Silence on your upkeep is pretty much going to throw the gauntlet down, because if they don't interact with it, then that's it. You're free to win the game. Very strong card. Grand Abolisher, this is another one. If you can get it out, if you can get this out before you start your combo, then it shuts everybody down for the most part. There's a few ways around this with like the channel abilities. Well, actually, yeah, the channel lands aren't shut down by this. But Grand Abolisher is 2 white for a 2/2, also human, cleric. During your turn, your opponents can't cast spells or activate abilities of artifacts, creatures, or enchantments. So, very strong. Most of the time, if somebody sees us entering the battlefield, it's raising red flags for the pod, because they expect you to be ending the game at that point. So this will get interacted with. This and Silence will tend to get interacted with, probably more so than your actual combo going off, because by that point, if you're able to lead off with these, then maybe even if they don't stick, maybe that's enough to draw out the interaction that the pod has available. Ranger Captain of Eos. This is another great card. I put it with the stacks, but it also does give us a tutor. So for 2 white and 1 generic, you get a 3/3, also human, Soldier Ranger. Unfortunately, it does have 3 toughness, so you can't go find it with the... Totally drawing a blank on the Recruiter of the Guard. So when Ranger Captain ETBs, you can search your library for a creature card with mana value 1 or less, reveal it, put it into your hand, and then shuffle. And then once it's on the battlefield, it's got this great ability that you can sacrifice Ranger Captain of Eos, and your opponents can't cast non-creature spells this turn. So it doesn't shut everything down, but if you have Ranger Captain on the board, this is another great one to force people's hands in your upkeep. Get to your upkeep, sacrifice Ranger Captain of Eos, and then if they don't have a way to interact with it, they're kind of hosed. And honestly, at that point, it's probably too late anyways, unless they have the ability to counter target activated ability. But if Ranger Captain's alive going into your turn, most of the time that's probably gonna protect you. Or you could use it offensively on somebody else's turn and sack it in response to something else that's going off, like an Ad Nauseam or Demonic Consultation on the stack or something like that. So it's a really strong card for 3 mana. Okay, then we get into our 2 counter spells, which I put in here just in the hopes that maybe it would matter. Did not matter. Most of the decks that I've seen with Saffi do not bother including them because they're really not very good. So you got Mana Tithe and Rebuff the Wicked. Mana Tithe will counter target any spell unless its controller pays 1. Probably not going to come up very often. I was thinking that this might be one of those ones that could potentially save you from a Force of Will, or one of the, or maybe like a Fierce Guardianship, like if they're already tapped out, and then just rolling the dice that they don't have a second alternative cost counterspell. It could work. It only costs 1 mana. There's probably, I would say there are better cards you could put into this deck. But I wanted the interaction. I wanted to pretend like I wasn't completely in terrible colors for that. So I put Mana Tithe in there, and then Rebuff the Wicked also costs 1, and counter target spell that targets a permanent you control. 100% defensive. Can protect your combo pieces if you got it in your hand when you're getting ready to go off. Could protect Ranger Captain of Eos, I guess. Although really they're targeting the abilities if they're going to interact with them. But yeah, same thing. Like I probably would not keep this in future iterations of this deck. It's just not that strong. Veil of Summer is very strong though. So coming from green, for 1 green, this is another one you could cast to preemptively to protect yourself. Actually, I guess you really couldn't cast this preemptively because you need your opponent to cast a blue or black spell. So it's 1 green, it's an instant. Draw a card if an opponent casts a blue or black spell this turn. Spells you control can't be countered this turn. Actually, I guess you could. You don't need that. It's just for the card draw. Spells you control can't be countered this turn. You and permanents you control gain hexproof from blue and from black until end of turn. This is really gonna... It's a good way to protect your combo if you still need to cast it, which you probably would. Like if it was already on the battlefield, why would you not have gone off already? But it's a very strong card. Highly recommend it. Put it in there. For the colors that we have in this deck, this is important. Then we get into one of our 1-cost creatures. I think the first one we've come across so far in the deck. And so this can be tutored for with Ranger Captain of Eos, but for 1 green, you get Allosaurus Shepherd. It is an elf, but this spell can't be countered. And green spells you control can't be countered. Very strong. We have more white spells than we have green spells in this deck, but Saffi's got green in her. The Renegade Rallier has green. There's enough important green creatures that's obviously that's helpful. And then also Greater Good is green. All of our finding creatures to put on the battlefield spells are green, so it's a really strong card. If you can get this out early, it's probably going to protect you in most situations there. And you got Surge of Salvation. This is actually a new card out of March of the Machine. So for 1 white, you and permanents you control gain hexproof until end of turn. Prevent all damage that black and or red sources would deal to creatures you control this turn. It's nice that it gives you hexproof as well. Just because that's a little bit of added utility to the card, but you're primarily going to be trying to protect your pieces of your combo pieces. And then if it prevents the damage, that's great. Probably not going to come up as much. Although maybe, I guess there are some. Maybe somebody's got a Lightning Bolt in the red deck. And you got Heroic Intervention. It's the classic. Permanents you control gain hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. Another nice way to protect your stuff. And then finally, Angel's Grace. This is probably one of my favorite cards of the entire deck. It will interact in ways that may or may not be readily apparent to you. So for 1 white, it's an instant with Split Second. And this is great. Because there's very few ways to interact with Split Second. Very, very few. So as long as the spell is on the stack, players can't cast spells or activate abilities that aren't mana abilities. So I'm not going to get into... I know that there's a couple niche ways to get around Split Second, but generally speaking, when you cast this, it will resolve, and then the stack will continue. So it says, you can't lose the game this turn, and your opponents can't win the game this turn. Until end of turn, damage that would reduce your life total to less than 1 reduces it to 1 instead. So this is your get out of jail free card. It will prevent your opponents from winning. And the most powerful combos in EDH or CEDH just say you win the game. They don't try to kill your opponents or interact with your opponents. They just win you the game. And this prevents that. So The dream situation, which I actually got to do in my final game, is opponent goes off. Opponent casts Thassa's Oracle. With Thassa's Oracle on the stack, opponent casts Demonic Consultation. You pass priority, letting Demonic Consultation resolve. And then while Thassa's Oracle's ETB is still on the stack, you then cast Angel's Grace, which means opponent cannot win. And you cannot lose. Which means that they have decked themselves and have, they're not dead, I think. I can't remember if Thassa's Oracle causes you to draw. I can't remember if they lose right then and there or not. But either way, it stops the Thoracle combo. And in Game 4, I actually got to do this. I was super pumped. This was the highlight of my tournament. Casting Angel's Grace with Demonic Consultation resolving and Thassa's Oracle's ETB on the stack. And I actually would have won that game, except as a parting gift, that particular opponent then wheeled us, and I had to discard. I think I had Revelark in my hand. I had all the other pieces available to make to do the combo on my next turn. But yeah, I discarded Revelark and drew into 7 really not good cards, like a bunch of lands and stuff. So unfortunately, they had their final revenge on me there, even though they didn't realize it. But I got to do this, and this was like something that I was super pumped about. Was really hoping I was going to get to do that interaction, and I did. So didn't win a single game, didn't really even come close, but I got to do that to a Thoracle player. So take that. All right, so that's the interaction. Then we got a stack of cards that are generally good stuff. They're going to help us out in some way, shape, or form. Sylvan Library is a classic. At the beginning of your draw step, you draw 2 additional cards, and then if you want to keep them, you pay 4 life for each of the 2 additional cards, or you can put 2 back in any order on top of your library. Great if you can get it early, like turn 1 or 2. Later in the game, probably not as useful, but Esper Sentinel, the Rhystic buddy here. So again, a classic and also a human. And also 1 mana, so this is another one we can go find with Ranger Captain, although probably be less likely to prioritize Esper Sentinel through Ranger Captain, because Ranger Captain's probably coming in on like turn 2 or turn 3 at the earliest. But whenever an opponent casts their first non-creature spell each turn, draw a card, unless that player pays X, where X is Esper Sentinel's power. So this gives us a little bit of card draw, along with same with Sylvan Library, which we need. We need the help. Until we get like Greater Good or something like that out, we don't have a really easy way to draw a bunch of cards. So something like Esper Sentinel can really help us out. Skull Clamp, this is another great one. This can also be pulled out of your deck through Urza's Saga. And we do have enough sack outlets that we could potentially utilize Skull Clamp and one of our mana producing sack outlets to do something similar to Greater Good, except we just get to keep the cards that we draw. We don't have to discard 3. So the way that would work is you'd have Saffi, you'd have one of your creatures, and we'll say Ashnod's Altar, because that actually would let us draw more cards. You go through the initial, if you don't have enough mana, and then Skull Clamp on the battlefield. Sorry. So you would do the initial loop to create two colorless mana. And then from there, you would pay 1 to equip Skull Clamp to Saffi. You would sacrifice her, targeting your Reanimator. You would draw 2 cards. Then you would pay the other generic that you got from the initial Ashnods to equip this to the Reanimator. You would sacrifice the Reanimator to Ashnods, drawing 2 cards, and creating 2 colorless. Then the loop would continue. So you would basically be able to draw 4 cards every situation, drawing what you needed until you got enough fast mana to pay for whichever source you wanted to use to end the game. So very strong card in this deck. Then we got Archivist of Ogma. So for 1 generic and a white, you get a 2/2 Halfling Cleric with Flash. Whenever an opponent searches their library, you gain a life and draw cards. This is a more fair version of or less oppressive version of Opposition Agent. So just it helps you, gives you some life. More importantly, lets you draw some cards while they're doing their tutoring. So if you can have this in hand early, a lot of times you'll be able to get some payoff. Carpet of Flowers is very situational, and I really debated about putting this in here, but the likelihood of you playing in a pod with a blue deck is pretty high. And at CEDH, they're probably not going to be running a bunch of islands necessarily, but they will probably be running lands that have the basic land type island on them, especially if they're using fetches to go pull stuff out, like Underground Sea or something like that. So Carpet of Flowers is a 1 green enchantment. During your main phase, you may add X mana of 1 color to your mana pool, where X is the number of islands target opponent controls. And then if you go read the Oracle text, this actually lets you pick which main phase you use it on. So if you haven't used it on your first main phase, you can use it on the second one, and you can change your targets, or you can choose your targets each time. So you don't have to like pick one opponent and then you're relying on them. So if you have a bunch of opponents, or if you have more than one blue player in your pod, then you have the potential to change it each turn based on who's playing what. I was able to play this in my last game. Actually, the opponent that I cast the Angel's Grace on had, I forget how many, I think at least 1 island. So it wasn't optimal, but it was an extra land, or an extra mana I was getting each turn, or yeah, once per turn in a main phase. So it wasn't as good as it could have been. And it's better to wait till they play a couple, because a lot of times they'll stop. They just won't play a land with the island type on it if you play Carpet of Flowers, so let them build a couple up. So this isn't a great turn 1 play, but unless you're just looking to like to have some degree of impact on your opponent's choices. Deep Known Terramancer. This is a late edition for me. I almost didn't put it in, and I didn't end up playing it, or it never came up. I didn't draw it or anything. But basically, it's 1 generic and a white for a 2/2 gnome wizard with flash with Mold Earth. So whenever 1 or more lands enters the battlefield under your opponent's control without being played, you may search your library for a plains card, put that onto the battlefield tapped, and shuffle, and do it only once each turn. Pretty situational, but with how many people fetch, I felt like this was going to be, there's at least a chance that I could get a little bit extra land on top of it. So if I could go find that Savannah, or the totally drawing a blank on the shock land, or even a basic, just a basic plains, like just having, if this even paid off even once, then it probably would have been worth it. So this is one that I would probably end up dropping in the future. And then finally, Eternal Witness. So this is just a way to pull any card out of my graveyard. So 2 green for 1, or 2 green and 1 generic for a 2/1 also human shaman, and a green one. When Eternal Witness enters the battlefield, you may return target creature card, or target card, from your graveyard to your hand. So pull something out of your graveyard, puts it in your hand. So then we have our essentially ramp, fast magic and other forms. Another area where my deck differed from a lot of the decks I've seen with Saffi online, like people that actually have gone to and played CEDH tournaments and events with, is that they tend to prioritize the mana dorks a little bit higher than I did. I kind of leaned more into what my deck was trying to do and not necessarily the support that would help. Probably, I'm assuming I could have done better if I had more mana dorks, if I had more stacks pieces. It's hard to say. I really haven't, for as much as I practiced with the deck, I haven't had actually a lot of real games with it. So I would say I would probably defer to those decks, though, like if they actually went to events with it, and some of them did quite well. So and my deck obviously did not. Granted, it's a small sample size, but this is probably not the true direction you would want to go with this deck if you were going to build it. But so the 1 mana dork I have in here is Birds of Paradise, because it's just a really good card, very strong. No reason not to put it in there. Earlier iterations, I had a couple other ones. I had some of the elves. I had Avacyn's Pilgrim in there. I think that was it. I didn't have as many as a lot of people do. Like, I didn't run the full gamut of 1 mana green mana dorks, but I had more than just Birds of Paradise. Elvish Spirit Guide is a great one. You would almost never cast it for its 3 mana cost for a 2/2. But as long as it's in your hand, you can exile it to add 1 green 1 green mana. So that's why it was in there, just more fast mana. Then we get into our artifacts. So Mox Diamond is a really strong one. You when it comes into play, you discard a land card, or you have to sack it, and then you add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool, which is great. Lotus Petal is just add 1 mana of any color, and then you sacrifice Lotus Petal. Chrome Mox, you got to exile a non-land card with it, and then you get to add 1 mana of any color of the exiled card's colors. So again, another 0 cost mana source there. Mox Amber. With Saffi being so cheap, I didn't mind putting Mox Amber in here because a lot of times I could get her out pretty early, especially if I had Mox Amber in hand. I didn't mind playing her early just to have Mox Amber online, because it's nice having a 0 mana tap for green or white. And then of course Mana Crypt and Mana Vault. I did not put Grim Monolith in here because it seemed like it was a little too slow, and I don't have any of the generate infinite mana combos like with was a power artifact or whatever. So it's Mana Vault for 1 mana is nice because it's tutorable with Urza's Saga, and it gives me 3 mana. So if I was able to find this, like as I was using Greater Good, then this plus 1 other mana source would let me cast a blasting station or something. And then of course Soul Ring, because why wouldn't you have Soul Ring in here? Arcane Signet for 1 mana of any color. And then you got Talisman of Unity as the last of the mana rocks. Did not put Selesnya Signet in here. Actually, I was going to try to get it, but the local store that I tend to buy my singles from apparently had it on listed in their stock, but it wasn't available. They must have gotten rid of it. I actually had that issue with Thalia, Guardian of Thraben. I purchased it to put in this deck, and I didn't look at the cards that they gave me that closely. And when I got home, I realized that they gave me the Thalia and Gitrog monster instead. So a little disappointing. That wouldn't have changed anything, but would have been nice to have. All right, then finally we're going to get into the lands. So we got some utility lands. So Iganjo and Boseiju. They're the two channel lands that we can put in here, and also probably the 2 strongest, I think. Ottawara is pretty good too, but I think these are 2 of the... Boseiju is definitely the best, and then I think Iganjo is right up there with it. So they are just regular untapped mana sources if you want to play them as lands, or you can channel it to discard Iganjo. Seed of Power deals 4 damage to target attacking creature or blocking creature, and it costs 1 generic less for each legendary creature you control, which I only have Saffi, which was another reason why I was kind of going back and forth as to whether I should include the Mox Amber. But again, she's cheap enough that she can turn these on, and both of these channel abilities are pretty cheap in and of themselves, so it's fine having them in here. Boseiju is even better. The channel, it costs 1 generic and a green to destroy target artifact, enchantment, or non-basic land an opponent controls. Then they could search the library for a land card with a basic type, put it on the battlefield, then shuffle. And it costs 1 less for each legendary creature like Iganjo does. Just a very strong card. Buried Ruin, if one of my stuff one of my artifacts got blown up, or I guess if I was needed to fix my colors and I had used my Lotus Petal, I could potentially pull this up there. But it's basically just a way to recur artifacts back to my to the top of my library. Or sorry, to my hand. This one returns it to your hand. So it's pretty strong when we're relying so heavily on artifacts in this deck. Command Beacon. I put this in here specifically to get around issues like Draneth Magistrate, because I absolutely need my commander to make this work. I could potentially use 2 of the reanimators, but I think it would have to be Revel Arc and Karmic Guide, because both Opposition Agent and Renegade Rallier can't target any of the other reanimators. So Command Beacon's in there specifically for that reason. And then Cavern of Souls, and this is why I highlighted humans so much, because Cavern of Souls, I'm 99% of the time when I play it, I'm gonna say humans. And it's really nice to be able to get around interaction with things that can't be countered, such as Allosaurus Shepherd and Cavern of Souls. So this is another one that I would prioritize pretty heavily if I was going to crop rotation something early on and I wasn't looking for high market. And then we get into our lands that are essentially our dual lands, since we only have 2 colors. So Command Tower, Savannah, Bountiful Promenade, Temple Garden. That was the shock land, so I couldn't remember. So these are my 2 dual lands that I can fetch for. Then we got Mana Confluence and Brushland. So the next 3 all do damage to myself if I... Actually, the next 4 I'll do damage to myself if I use them for any of the colors. Brushland I can also tap for a generic, which is nice. And then Reflecting Pool... Actually, I take it back, sorry. Reflecting Pool does not. City Brass, that's what I was thinking of. Horizon Canopy also has the added benefit of I could sack it to get a card if I needed to, if I was like really digging deep. And then Reflecting Pool, the downside to Reflecting Pool is you need to have another land in play, and I can't tell you how many times I've wound up with this as one of my like 1 or 2 lands in my hand. Not a big deal if I have other lands in there, but I would wind up with like 2 lands in hand with a 1 or 2 lands in hand with like a Mox Diamond, and then it just it feels bad. Those are the times when you probably want to look more seriously at mulliganing. And then I threw Gemstone Caverns in here because if it pays off, it's great. So if it's in your opening hand and you're not playing first, you can begin with it in play. You just with a luck counter on it, and then you have to exile a card from your hand. And then you can tap to add 1 generic to your mana pool, or if it has a luck counter, you can instead add 1 mana of any color. So you're really hoping that that's in your opening hand and you're not going first. And then Gaia's Cradle. This is another one that I would prioritize for crop rotation, or to go find with crop rotation. One of the biggest differences, if you just look at without actually looking at the cards, if you look at the deck lists of people that play Saffi other than myself, and then you look at my deck list, they have way more creatures than I do. I think I was clocking in at like 20-ish, like 18 to 20, and most of them are in the 30s, like low 30s. So Gaia's Cradle is going to have a bigger payoff for them. But my thought process was that even though I don't have a lot of creatures, I have ways to get creatures. And as long as I have at least 2 creatures on the battlefield, or really at least 1, then I can use it as a land. But as soon as I have 2 or more, then I'm just getting extra mana. And that's kind of what I was looking at. It has a strong potential to be fast mana. It might not be as game defining as some other decks that can just produce a ton of creatures on the battlefield, or token creatures or whatever. But it's still pretty strong, so I recommend putting it in there. Ancient Tomb, because of course getting extra mana is great. Yavimaya, Cradle of Growth, because this will actually help us with a lot of our utility lands there, helping us get them to turn or tap for green without damaging us. Or sorry, not utility lands in that case. That would be just dual lands essentially. But it's a good card, and there's not as many decks playing green. It seems like blue, black, and white, and I guess red with some of them, or it seemed to be a little bit higher priority than green decks from what I've seen like at our event. There were not a lot of green players, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So Yavimaya wasn't like helping other people as much as like a Yawgmoth or Tomb of Yawgmoth would. So I think it's still worth putting in there. And then our pathway, our Selesnya pathway, and our fetch land. I only have the 1 fetch land in here because I only had 2 dual lands, and I know it's kind of, I probably should have put more in here, but I just didn't really. I have more basic lands than a lot of the other decks do, so I just didn't really feel the need to put it in there. But if you're going to go with what a lot of these other decks, or how they build their decks, they have most of the fetch lands that can either fetch for a plains or a forest in there, and like 1 or 2 basics. So I have 5 of each, 5 forests and 5 plains. Okay, so that's the deck. I know this is going to be probably my longest video to date, but I will talk just a little bit more here if anybody's still paying attention. Um, so I kind of already talked for the most part about the differences between how I built my deck and the more common way this deck is seen. It's not like it's a obviously not a super high powerful or well it can be powerful, not a super popular deck in the CEDH sphere. But you know it definitely has the potential. You really, I think, to be successful with this, your opening hand is the most critical, but you probably need to prioritize your stacks pieces early, more so than combo pieces. So if I was going to rebuild this differently, I would put a lot more stacks in there, and yeah, I would as far as the deck building, that's probably would be my one of my biggest changes, and then I would mulligan more aggressively to make sure I have a playable path for the first couple turns, to where if nothing else, can shut down everyone else, um, or have the ability to start my path down towards my combo. So I'll talk about the tournament real quick. So like I said, it was a 6 round tournament, but you played the first 4 rounds, and then only the top 16 progressed to round 5, and then only the top 4 progressed to round 6. So round 1, my pod was the Zendikar Rising Omnath at 2 Kennons, which was a great time, and then myself, Saffi. So surprise, surprise, one of the Kennons won. They basically were able to go off. Nobody could do anything about it. They got back to their second turn, or they got back around to their turn, and then won the game. Cyrus Stagnation came out pretty early on, and as they were going through their Kennan triggers, and so that shut down what little interaction I had. Couldn't even cast Saffi at that point, so it was what it was. Round 2 was myself. We had a Winota player, we had a Malcolm and Vile Smasher partner, and then a Krark and Sakashima player. And Malcolm and Vile Smasher won that one. I don't remember exactly how that went down. So Kennen won on turn 4 in the first round. They won in turn 3 in round 2. I just don't remember exactly how they ended up going off, but there wasn't anything anybody could do about it. That was probably my worst game in terms of like what I was able to play. Round 3 we had was it Marilyn of the Morn Song, the one where you don't draw cards but you get to go tutor each turn. Myself, Rial, and Najila, and Najila won that one. I don't remember the exact turn. I think it was either turn 3 or turn 4. And then the final game, which was by far the most entertaining, because like I said, this is the one that I got to do the Angel's Grace thing, messing up their combo, because they fully thought they were winning up until that second. So it was myself, Timna, and Crom, that was the player that had the combo get killed. Killian, Ink Duelist, which was the player who actually won, and then Krenko, who was playing a faster paced deck. Krenko probably could have won, but he was spreading the damage around, because by that point we knew we weren't competing for anything, so we were just more having a good time. And then Killian was the one that I cast Kenneth's transformation on, so it slowed it down a little bit because he had a lot of stuff on him, and he had Menace, which I couldn't deal with. So that prolonged my life for a turn or two, but Killian ended up winning. I think he killed Krenko off, and then it got back to me, and I just needed to top deck something spectacular, and didn't happen. So yeah, so that was my tournament, but it was a ton of fun. That was my first like real CEDH level, like where the majority of people were playing CEDH. I would say probably at least 70 to 75% of the field were playing legitimate CEDH decks. It was didn't quite work out. I was hoping to do a little bit better with Saffi, but it was a great learning experience. Already kind of working on putting together a different deck for the next one, because I'm sure we'll do another one. So yeah, I hope everyone enjoyed that. Like I said, my longest video to date, so I apologize for those that absolutely hate long videos. You probably aren't watching it at this point anyways, but thanks for those that have. As always, love to hear what your thoughts are on this. This deck I've probably put the most thought and energy into. Gruta is still by far my favorite deck, but I spent it was a long, slow process to get this deck built. And I went through multiple iterations, cut a bunch of cards, added a bunch of cards, slowly working my way towards what I wanted. It wasn't until like the final couple days where I actually took a look online to see what everyone else was doing with it. And that's where I made kind of some of those, kind of tweaked it a little bit to get more in their direction with like the extra stacks pieces, because I only had a couple for most of the versions of this deck. But it is what it is. It is doing decent out there. Like, it's had some top 16 finishes. In some other tournaments, I've seen it go into top 4, just from like results that were posted. So it is possible. She is 100% a combo piece. So having a 2-mana combo piece in your command zone is always nice. Probably the biggest weakness is probably the colors more than anything, because Selesnya is really tough to pull together a strong, reliable CEDH deck. I think, in my opinion, like that color combination is probably going to be the hardest, one of the hardest, if not the hardest, to compete with the other decks that are 1 or 2 card combo winning, and in the first couple turns there. So you're really hoping that you're paired with a bunch of high octane decks that are interacting with each other and shutting each other down, so you can kind of sneak in for the win there, which did not happen, but it is what it is. Actually, I will say before I go is that I actually would get pieces out, and apparently enough to like scare my opponents. Like, I would get like Saffi out on the board and then Academy Rector, and still missing like a Sack Outlet or something, and then everyone's like, oh no, he's about to go off. And of course I'm not going to say yes or no to that, outside of the politicking that would be appropriate depending on the group of players there. But they were definitely giving it more credit than what it was due. So maybe I was being a little bit too scary early on and needed to slow it down even more or something. But who knows? It was a lot of fun. So hope everyone enjoyed it. If you liked what you saw, please give us a like. If you'd like to see more, please subscribe. New content every week, mostly pack cracking right now, because they're a little bit quicker, and I have some of those videos saved where I don't have to shoot if if I'm like just super busy on the real world side. And then when I'm able to, I do these Commander deck tech videos, which I do have some decks that I need to shoot videos for, so hopefully I'll be able to get those in the weeks ahead here. So, and yeah, throw those comments down there. Thanks again, everyone, and until next time.